Hello and welcome to Friday's edition of Beef Talk, brought to you by Teagasc in association with the Irish Farmers Journal. I'm Adam Woods, livestock editor with the Irish Farmers Journal, and today we'll be covering topics such as CAP reform, European beef policy, economics of dairy calf to beef systems, economics of suckler beef systems, and future challenges and opportunities for the industry. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Paul Crosson, Beef Enterprise Leader here at Teagasc Grange, Pearse Kelly, Head of Knowledge Transfer in the Dry Stock section in Teagasc, and Kevin Hanrahan, Head of the Rural Economy and Development Unit in Athenry. Paul, if I go to you first, I guess it's been a really busy week. What have you found, or how have you found the Beef Virtual Week over the last few days?
Yeah, it's been a wonderful week, Adam. I suppose this would have been the year when we should have had our normal open day, but I suppose with the pandemic and the situation that arose from that, that wasn't possible. So we moved to a virtual event, totally new event, and I suppose set of circumstances for us all. And I have to say, delighted with the viewership and the participation and engagement in the week. I have to give huge thanks to all the farmers in particular who participated in the week. We had quite a few farmer videos. We had farmers participating on panels such as this and so on, all giving their time and giving their information, opening their gates essentially to this Beef Week. I also want to thank the staff in Teagasc who all, again, as I say, it was a new venture for us and all put their shoulder to the wheel. And made it, I think, a very successful event. I also want to thank, I suppose, yourselves in the Farmers Journal and all our sponsors, in particular FBD Trust, who made this week possible. We've had a fantastic week. We've covered a huge amount of ground. I suppose we're bringing it to a close today, and we look forward to the discussion today.
I guess, Paul, getting down to business, farm income's very low. Beef price running at $350, $360 a kilo. We've Brexit coming down the tracks. We've Mercosur waiting in the wings. It's a really tough time to be a beef farmer. Where, in your opinion, I guess, did it all go wrong, or where can we put it right?
Well, I suppose if you look at the economics of farm systems, it has been a challenging situation for some time. If we go back 4 or 5 years, average farm income's 12,000, 13,000 on suckler beef farms, so a very low level of income by any standard. We then had obviously the fodder and the weather crisis of 2018. Which brought our farm incomes down sub 10,000, 8,500. I know the recent release of the National Farm Survey shows that it's up slightly, but still just over 9,000 per farm. So income's very, very challenging. But I suppose, if we look further back, that income situation and the challenge there on beef farms, you mentioned Mercosur. We've been talking about trade agreements with Mercosur for a long, long time. That has always been in the wings. If we go further back and look at, CAP reform, back to when I started here in Teagasc Grange, we were looking at the midterm review, what became the fish law reforms and the removement of the suckler headage payment. And that many people thought sounded the death knell for the suckler herd. It has proven to be a very resilient sector. There's a great tradition of beef farming in this country, notwithstanding the very serious economic challenges. The suckler herd, as I say, it has remained resilient. Numbers have come back slightly. We're probably after coming from 1.2, 1.1 million cows. We're just short of 1 million cows at the moment. It's still a substantial herd certainly by European standards, and still a very important herd, not only for the farm families that it supports, but also for the wider beef industry and the wider beef trade that it underpins. So has proven to be very resilient. There are challenges, and there are challenges that we will need to address.
I guess if we move on to research, Paul, and look at beef research and maybe the strategy for the next 10 years, and I forgot to congratulate you at the very beginning on your recent appointment as Beef Enterprise Leader here in Grange. I guess I maybe sometimes think that maybe we've got it all wrong in relation to beef research, that we'll say you're going to talk about maybe more animals per hectare, you're going to talk about higher output, but yet with the vast majority of our beef farms, they're part-time, they're operating on a part-time basis, and those options that you will talk about aren't there maybe for those part-time farmers. Is beef research, and is the research that's taking place here in Grange, is it relevant to the vast majority of beef farmers out there?
Yeah, I suppose, Adam, you have to look at the research programme in its totality. The normal, I suppose, focus is on the likes of Dairy Patrick and so on, which is natural because it's a research herd and people can, I suppose, relate to it to a greater extent. But the research programme is much, much broader than that. If we look at the component research, the animal level research, we have a programme focusing on, fertility, cow fertility, bull fertility. We have a programme focusing on neonatal calf health and animal health right through the life cycle of the animal. from bovine respiratory disease right through to parasitology and the challenges with antibiotic resistance. The program then looks at live weight performance, different feeding management practices, different feeds and feeds that are available to farms, and right through to meat quality at the finishing stage. So there's a very broad program, and regardless of whether you have 10 cows or 100 cows, age at first calving at 2 years of age, rather than we'll say 30 months, which is close to the national average. That 6 months is an important cost, regardless of the intensity or the number of cows you have. Equally, reproductive performance, if we look at the likes of calving interval, 365 days is the target. National average is closer to 400 days. So clearly that's about a month of production that's lost in the system. Again, regardless of your stocking intensity, regardless of the number of animals you have, that is a cost that's carried on the system. So I suppose the component research is very much applicable to a much broader swathe of farmers. Clearly, the research farm systems do operate at a high level of stocking rate. But when we look at that, if we go back to the Profit Monitor analysis, the National Farm Survey analysis, or indeed the Teagasc Farmers Journal Better Farm programme, we've seen from all of those programmes where you have farmers that are full-time and focused on driving profitability, that stocking rate, once you have good level of individual animal performance and maximise output per livestock unit, then stocking rate is the next driver of profitability on those farms.
So the overriding theme has been higher stocking rate, higher output. Are we saying then for a part-time farm, we can never get to those levels? And is there another answer for those part-time farmers in terms of making a higher income?
Yeah, look, it's a very important question. I think going back to the farm income situation, if we look at that figure of 8,000 to 9,000 over the last number of years, clearly that's a very, very low level of income. We should also remind ourselves that on those farms, direct support payments and non-cattle income, let's say, is accounting for about 13,000 of revenue on those farms. So I think the first thing I would say for any farm, but in particular, let's say lower stocked, smaller scale farms, that maximising income from support payments, and there are a broad range of support payments apart from BPS there at the moment, BDGP, BEEP, GLOS and so on, TAMS for farms that want to invest, they are critically important. Now we, as Teagasc, are a knowledge transfer and a knowledge-based organisation, so we would particularly see much merit in BDGP and BEEP. I mean, it's the double win, if you like, that the farm income is supported, but also we're providing important information back to the industry. So I'd say for those farms that maybe are not pushing stocking rate, those support schemes are important. But I wouldn't totally ignore the importance of technology. As I said, regardless of the number of cows you have, regardless of your stocking intensity, compact calving in the spring will benefit all farms. It'll allow long grazing seasons, good weaning performance, good weaning weights, the whole area of herd health. Probably you could argue even more so with a small scale farm. If you lose a calf or if one calf doesn't thrive in a small herd compared to a large herd, the proportional impact is much greater. So yes, the support payments, I would say, focus on those and make sure to maximise drawdown on those. We've seen the recent, I suppose, proposals from CAP in terms of the direction that's going in, but also, stay focused on the technology as well inside the farm gate.
I know Kevin later on is going to delve into deeper in terms of CAP supports and where that's coming for the next 10 years. I guess moving on to Suckler Beef Systems, Paul, I sometimes envy Aidan Brennan on the dairy side of the house. Is that you milk a cow, you sell the milk, and it's very, very simple. It's a spring grass-based production system. Whereas on the beef side of the house, we've so many different production systems. And the question I often get asked is, what is the most profitable beef production system? Or is there one that farmers should be heading down and that's it, just stick with it?
Look, I suppose it goes back to the initial point that there's no system that's going to absolutely revolutionise profitability. We've seen that from farm to farm. We've autumn calving systems, spring calving systems, going to beef, going to weaning, going to store. And look, there can be variations, and depending on the year and depending on what the farmer prioritises on his farm, there can be a ranking in terms of profitability, but none of them will show a huge difference. I suppose if we go back to our blueprint and what we've learned from the likes of the Better Farm programme, compact spring calving from a cost point of view is the most cost efficient system. You simply don't have the cost of feeding the cow to the same extent, the expense of supplementary feeding required in an autumn system. and equally the cost of grass silage, obviously very high quality grass silage in terms of not allowing it to bulk, and the contractor cost per acre and per tonne. All of those costs are much greater in an autumn system.
Is that relevant across all systems? So if you're selling weanland, you're selling stores, you're finishing animals, is it the same no matter what system you're in?
Yeah, the way I would look at it, Adam, is that your cow herd and the structure of your cow herd, that's going to be fixed for a number of years. So, that part of the system, you should manage it from a long-term cost management perspective. The other elements of the system, the trading part of it, whether you go to weanling, whether you go to store, whether you go to bull beef, steer beef, whatever your choice is, that can obviously be something that you change year on year, depending on the market, depending on the cash flow situation. But the cow herd is one that's going to be much more longer term. Of course, over a number of years you can change that, but it will take a number of years. In terms of the trading part of it, what we will have seen is that weanling systems would typically have lower margins than our finishing systems. Particularly, again, depending on the market and your relationship with the processor. Bull beef systems in years will have shown very good profit, particularly under 16-month bulls, but that has limits in terms of the number of animals that the market requires for that. So steer beef system, if we look at our blueprint system and the system that's more, let's say, applicable to a broader number of farmers, trying to finish early, if we look at our average finishing age for our most efficient farms, finishing steers at about 22 months of age, at about 400 kilo carcass. Compare that with the national average, also 400 kilo carcass, but 6 months older, about 28 months of age. So within all of those systems, there are gains to be made. There is a slight ranking depending on the year and the market. So in some years, you will get a very good export trade, and some farmers will have the ability, the animals and the genetics to exploit that. Other years, you have a good trade in bulls, as you know better than any of us. But by and large, focusing on a compact, low-cost spring calving system should underpin all of those. As I say, autumn calving, perhaps if you have maybe more of an export orientation, but certainly spring calving would be the lowest cost system we would have analysed.
You mentioned bulls there, and I guess we've seen a dramatic fall off in the number of bulls being killed on a weekly basis at the moment due to processor direction, I guess, during 2019. And we've shown in the past, as part of the Better Farm programme, that the most profitable farms were doing bull beef. We're doing it on Tullamore Farm. Is there a real income challenge there now for those farms that were participating in bull beef systems that are now being asked to change to a different system? And can that income be made up in any other system? Yeah,
I suppose you have to look at the reason why the bull beef system is more profitable. I think one of the advantages is you kill the animals earlier, therefore your capacity to carry more is available to farmers who want. So again, it comes down to farmers that really want to push the boat out in terms of the number of cows they carry and in terms of profitability. So yeah, absolutely. Where those farmers have lost that avenue to kill bulls, as we see at the moment, that is a real challenge. I think it's going back to the basics, focusing on a very efficient steer system. If we look at what our market demands and what we have the beautiful image behind us here of grass-based system, and the image from a trade point of view and the image from a consumer point of view are heifers and steers grazing paddocks. So and that's a big selling point for us. In the short term, it doesn't solve the situation for bull beef finishers who have lost that market. I think there will still be always a small market for bulls, and some will be able to take advantage of that. But we have to, I suppose, remember that we do export 90% of what we produce, and that market is predominantly a steer heifer beef market.
But from a climate point of view and a carbon footprint point of view, I think you've shown that bull beef systems compare really well with our grass-based steer systems.
Yeah, and look, we had a very interesting discussion earlier in the week on sustainability, and of course we addressed those type of issues. And I think, to me, it's the importance of viewing sustainability in a much broader lens, if you like. Greenhouse gas emissions gets a huge amount of focus, and rightly so. It is probably the number one challenge. But there are other challenges around biodiversity, around animal welfare, around what society expects food production to be. And it's much more than greenhouse gas emissions. But you have hit on a very important point, that we do have to, I suppose, as a food industry, and maybe to articulate it more to the public, articulate that message that there is a trade-off there. Bull beef and indeed more intensive feeding systems will lead to lower carbon footprint, but that will come at a trade-off to other expectations that society has of food production.
Okay, Paul, you're a beef enterprise leader. You're in a position of power here now in Teagasc and Grange. I guess themes of research, or where do you see the most important points of research for the next, we'll say, 10, 15 years on this unit?
Yeah, I suppose, look, Kevin's going to speak to the recent proposals coming from the European Commission around CAP. I think the direction of travel is very clearly around sustainability. It has been that for some time. If we look at, if you want to call it traditional research programs, traditionally it was looking at, production technologies to maximize productivity, output of beef, value of beef from beef farm systems. We then moved, I suppose, more to looking at still productivity, but having a measure of environmental impact from those levels of improvement in productivity. So you might look at different feeding mechanisms. Does that improve animal performance? And maybe what is the impact of that on methane emissions? But now we're moving much more to, looking at the actual primary outcome being, a measure of sustainability, and can we maintain or improve productivity while we improve sustainability? So I think that's going to underpin our research program, and I think research programs globally for the next certainly decade, maybe more. But I think the underlying technologies will still need to be addressed. If we look at the easiest win, or if you want to call it the low-hanging fruit from the point of view of farm productivity and improving sustainability at the same time, there are a huge number of technologies available. I mentioned aged first calving, reproductive performance, live weight performance, calving rates and so on. All of those improve efficiency, reduce waste in the system, and are an improvement in profitability. I think a further area, you mentioned, and rightly so as well, Adam, the issue of part-time farming, a lot more off-farm employment. I think the area of labour efficiency and a much more detail around labour efficient practices on farms. The technology is there now. We have smartphone technology. We have a lot more remote farming technology, and all of those will have a role to play in improving the labour efficiency of our farm system. So that will play a role as well.
Okay, I'm farming 40 suckler cows on 100 acres in Roscommon, heavy farm. Give me the 3 or 4 things that farmer should be focusing on to put more money in their pocket at the end of the year, or where does the research point to on that? Yeah,
I suppose if we go back to where the average farm system is compared to where the very best farmers are, and we've seen a number of them during the week on this panel and on other panels, and we've addressed the various technologies. To me, it's around reproductive performance. Age at first calving, that's 6 months, is a very substantial loss to the industry. Subsequently, rebreeding the cow every year, so shortening that anestrus period. And that all revolves around, I suppose, if you were to identify 3 broad areas that will really benefit reproductive performance as well as live weight performance: nutrition, husbandry, and genetics. And again, all of that underpinned by health, if I was to bring in a 4th one. So nutrition around managing body condition. In other words, what we're saying is, building condition over a long grazing season. We know that grass, we have a competitive advantage in growing and grazing grass in this country. We have to maximise that. Put condition on the cow over the summer period, and mobilise that over the winter period. So we want our cows calving down in a condition of probably high 2s or close to 3, to enable that cow to rebreed quickly for a subsequent breeding season. And that is fundamental. And underpinning, as I say, that genetics, husbandry and health. So we need to manage all of those factors in order to maximise profitability on our farm systems.
Thanks, Paul. We'll leave it there. Some really interesting points there, and looking forward to the next, I guess, 10 years here in Grange and what research will come out of it. Pearse, moving on to you. You've been looking at dairy calf to beef systems. Tell me a little bit about what you've been looking at.
Okay, Adam. So we've been looking at, I suppose, the figures that really, the last 10 years, we've seen a huge increase, obviously, in dairy cow numbers. What we've seen there is that, we've gone from a little over 1 million, and we're up over heading for, the 1.5, 1.6 it looks like now. And if we look at that then within the kind of context of, well, what kind of beef is going to come from that dairy herd, within Teagasc we've been looking at those that I suppose avalanche of calves that are going to come from the dairy side, and we've been looking at that in Johnstown Castle, and we've also been looking at it here in Grange. We've also been looking at it on our Green Acres programme in terms of, you know, what's going to happen to these calves, what's going to be the best systems for them, what's going to be the kind of outputs that we expect from them. What we've also seen in the dairy herd in the last 10 years is that, you know, we've gone from a situation where, you know, 30 to 40% were being bred to a beef bull, but as that dairy herd has expanded and doesn't need as much replacement efforts, there was massive expansion there, I suppose, after quotas were removed, and we get to see then that, you know, as that herd has kind of nearly maxed out or is heading towards maxing out, you know, more and more of that dairy herd now is a higher percentage of it is going towards the beef side of the house, being bred to beef sires. So, you know, in the last couple of years, we're moving up closer to 40 to 45% of that dairy herd has been bred. And the breeds that we're seeing those dairy being bred to, the beef bulls that are being bred to, big increase in Angus and Hereford that have been coming. So that's really, you know, driven our, I suppose, research and our knowledge transfer for the last 5 to 6 years. So if we say, well, okay, what are we going to do in terms of, you know, look at systems on those? If we look at our blueprints that we've developed in the last number of years, and we look at 2 different stocking rates, go back to what, say, Paul was saying there, and going back to what you were saying there, Adam, you know, we have very, very high stocking rates, and that's, I suppose, a lot of what our research over the last 5 to 10 years has been driven on. But if we now look at it and we say, well, okay, taking cognizance of the fact that not everybody can operate at 2.5, 3 livestock units per hectare, where can they operate at? If we say, okay, a more moderate stocking rate, and if we look at, say, 2 different stocking rates that are being operated there, and we say, you know, if we take, say, a standard system, 22-month steer system, early maturing, so Angus or Hereford bullocks being brought through to beef at 22 months of age, and we say 2 different stocking rates, one where you're finishing two bullocks per hectare, or another where you're finishing 3.2. So if you take a 100-acre farm or a 40-hectare farm, that'd be buying in 80 calves or buying in 130 calves per year and bringing them through to beef. What are the kind of different economics? What are the different outputs coming from those herds? And if we say then on that, you know, two steers to the hectare, that's coming in at 146 kilograms of organic nitrogen. So it's well below the derogation of 170, whereas the 3 bullocks to the hectare, or 3.2, is up at 240. You're heading for the 250 kilograms of organic nitrogen per hectare. That's a stocking rate of 1.7 or 2.8. In terms of the amount of grass that's needed, typically in this country, beef farmers are growing and utilising somewhere in the region of 5.5 to 6 tonnes per hectare. So that's where your two bullocks to the hectare is coming in. Whereas if you're up at the 3 bullocks per hectare, you know, you're up at that 10 tonnes of grass, which is a lot higher on that. How much nitrogen then is needed on that? Just a couple of the kind of figures. You know, you're looking at a very typical 80 to 90 kilograms of nitrogen, chemical nitrogen per hectare at the lower stocking rate, whereas the higher stocking rate, you're up heading for 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. If we then say, well, what are the outputs and what are the inputs going into that, and what are the assumptions? And we have to do a little bit of assumptions here looking forward and look at, say, beef price and that. We're assuming that a 22-month bullock will kill, and that it's more than achievable at 300 kilo carcass. Typically, though, we're looking at an O equals 3+ at that age. And an assumed beef price that we're talking about there, okay, it's higher than what we've seen in the last 12, 18 months, but we're kind of looking long term. We're hoping beef prices will recover as the kind of bit more balance comes into the market. But, you know, at a beef price there of a base beef price of 3.75 per kilo, and we've put into the assumptions €160 to buy the calf. That's probably a little bit high on the calf, and the beef price is probably a little bit high, so when one balances out the other. If you follow through then into terms of the economics of that big difference in the amount of carcass that's produced, you know, you're looking at nearly 600 kilos of carcass coming from the lower stocking rate, whereas you're heading for 1,000 kilos coming from the higher stocking rate. And then that obviously feeds through then into the gross output, 1,900 of a gross output versus a little over 3,000, and then that filters all the way through to gross margin and net margin. So you end up there really at the lower stocking rate or the medium stocking rate, and you'd have to say that that's not a low stocking rate, but it is still, it's probably more typical of what we see there out on beef farms. There is the potential, excluding any direct payments, to make a net margin there of €180 to €200 at the assumptions that we've put into the blueprints. Whereas at the higher stocking rate, which is probably more typical of your more full-time, larger commercial farm, maybe he's not working off farm, has a lot more time, has a lot more sheds, has a lot more resources on the farm, you're looking at €400 to €500 of a net margin. So those are typically what you see in the 22-month. And if you say, listen, another system just to compare it would be a 19-month early maturing, again Angus, Hereford heifers being killed before their second winter. You know, you're looking again, typically, without going through all the figures there again, you're looking at net margin of, so, you know, 200, you're in around €200 for the more medium stocked rate farmed. That's 2.83 heifers per hectare, whereas if you're up at 4 heifers per hectare, again you're up in around the €450 per hectare. So those are typically what you'd see for the economics as it currently stands. And there's a lot of assumptions gone in there, but based on the research and based on what we've seen coming from, as I said, Johnstown, coming from Grange, and coming from a Green Acres programme.
2 questions, Pearse. I guess the 1 million beef calves for beef production, is that a problem for the dairy industry or is it a problem for the beef industry? Because if we ask our beef farmers to take on these calves, with supply and demand principles come into play, with too many cattle to kill in the country, beef price goes down. And not to pit one against the other, but really the dairy industry need the beef industry here to take these on board, because going down the route of bobby calves or going down the route of unsustainable practices like that isn't an option. So we need to be very careful here.
Yeah. So in answer to your question then, Adam, is it an issue for the dairy herd needs to worry about, or is it an issue for the beef side? It's both, actually, because there's a balance here, and there's things, as you said, in terms of the dairy herd, as we see there's 1 million calves coming from the dairy herd. Okay, live exports have been quite good in the last couple of years. We saw in 2019, we saw in around 200,000 calves leaving the country. But we already see Board BA figures this year, because of COVID-related problems and that, we're back somewhere between 50 to 60,000 calves. Maybe that'll balance out before the end of the year. But we don't know what's coming down the line in terms of live exports over the next number of years. So the reality is those calves are going to be in the country. The big issue then, from a beef farmer's point of view, is what's the genetics of those calves? Because calling a spade, that has been the issue over the last 5 to 10 years. If I'm a beef farmer and I'm looking at what calves are coming, if I want to make a profit on those calves, I need a carcass weight. You see on the figures there, we're assuming that you're going to have a carcass weight of 300 kilos at a steer at 22 months and a 240 to 250 kilo carcass for heifers. The reality is, what we're seeing out there on beef farms for the last 4 to 5 years especially, is that achieving those good carcass weights, acceptable carcass weights from a marketing point of view and from a factory point of view, is becoming more and more difficult. So that really goes back then in terms of the genetics of those calves. So as a beef farmer, what I'm looking for is an animal that will grow well, shape well, and I'll get a good price, and that will return me a worthwhile margin for the time that I put in. Because as you see from the economics there, even at an assumed beef price of $3.75 per kilo and a carcass that's 300 kilos at 22 months, there's not a fortune to be made from these. And that's not giving the dairy farmer a fortune for his calf either at 160. If that 375 came back even 10 cent a kilo to closer to where we're base price at 365, that's straight away a 30 euro off the price of the value of the carcass. Take that 30 euro off the calf, you're back to 130, which is probably where Angus bull and Hereford bull calves were in 2020. But everything needs to be going well to make that net margin at a medium stocking rate of €200 or at a high stocking rate of 400.
You mentioned there, I guess, a 300 kilo carcass at 22 months, maybe a 250, 260 at 19 months for heifers. The reality is we're not there, and we're not anywhere near there. We're closer to 30 months at that stage. How does that impact profitability levels on farm if we move that out to the national average of where we're killing those animals at 30 months? Does it result in a negative net margin if we move that out to 30 months? Yeah,
so as you move out, okay, so the system I looked at there, just really for today's purpose of this morning's discussion, was a 22 month. The reality is what we've seen in a lot of our work in Johnstown Castle, and Dr. Rob Prendeville would have done a lot of work down there over the years, and the system that Rob actually showed consistently that was coming out to be the most profitable was the steer system being slaughtered off grass in the third summer at 26, 27 months. Now, just I suppose to clarify that was on a per head basis, okay? So if you then say if you want to stock at a very high stocking rate, you're probably moving more back towards the 2 year. But the per head basis suits a lot of people, because if you again go back to a lot of your typical beef farmers, they don't have a huge amount of housing and they don't have the money to invest in a huge amount of housing. And the last thing we want to do is to ask people to invest 100, 150,000 euro on a beef farm to try and get that back over the next 15 to 20 years. So for the most part, what we're trying to do is encourage people, work with what you have. And if that means you have a reduced amount of housing, then it probably does mean you won't be able to go at a very high stocking rate, because when you go to that 2-year system, there is a lot of housing needed. Whereas you move out to the third summer, you need less housing, and it's more a per head basis then that becomes important.
I get asked this question all the time, and it's in relation to suckler beef versus dairy beef, and which is more profitable, and should I switch to dairy calf to beef? Have you looked at that, and how does each system compare?
We've looked at those figures, and anytime we've looked at those figures, and that's a question that we constantly are asked too, and when both are done at a similar level of management, at a high level of management, on a per livestock unit basis, as Paul said, not so much on a stocking rate or a per hectare basis, there's very little difference between them. There really is. At a quite a high stocking rate on well-drained soil, as I said, with plenty of resources, plenty of housing and that, the potential there is to make somewhere between, 350 to 450 of a net margin per hectare excluding premium. At the more medium, probably more typical commercial stocking rates, you're probably back to somewhere between 100 to 200, and then you're at a break even for the lower stocking rates that we see. Kevin, I'm sure we'll give the figures later on at a national farm survey level, where you're closer to 1 livestock unit rather than 2 livestock unit. You're at best in a good year, you're breaking even on those farms. But really, when you look across most of the systems, there's differences within them, whether it's bulls or bullocks, and different years can have different impacts on that. But the reality is, dairy calf to beef versus suckling, done at a high level of management, there's not a huge amount of difference between either of them.
In terms of the genetics that have been used, and you touched on it there a minute ago as regards dairy farmers and genetics, are Teagasc talking out of both sides of their mouth here? We've Teagasc more part pushing EBI, which is reducing the beef merits in that EBI all the time, and yet we have the beef side of the house saying we need better calves here and we need to be conscious of that. For farmers out there, it's maybe confusing that you have Teagasc would say, with those two messages, where do you think that's going, or where can we find a solution to that issue?
Yeah, so the EBI definitely is obviously going to have to be, from a dairy point of view, going to be more milk orientated than that, but you do want to obviously see a level of beef traits in there, because we have such a number of beef animals coming from it. There's two developments, I suppose. One of them is already out there that we see, the new dairy beef index. We've seen an uptake of that, and we've seen during the week, throughout the week in the virtual beef week, how that has been used, especially on Tuesday and that. And the dairy beef index really is the tool for the dairy farmer to say, well, okay, if I want to improve the quality and I want to improve the carcass weight of the calves so that I have more saleable animal going to my beef farm and neighbour, I'll concentrate, after I've used EBI in a high percentage of my cows, the remaining percentage I'll use on a high DBI, whether that's a high DBI AI bull or it's a high DBI stock bull. A new development also that is very close to coming out from ICBF and developed in conjunction with Teagasc is what's called Beef's Own Worth, so BOW, and we're going to hear a lot more about this on beef farms over the next number of years. Because, and this really is to say, well, if I go out to buy a calf or I go out to buy a store animal, what is that animal's worth based on its genetics today to me? And I'm not interested in, was it easy calving? Because it's already on the ground. I'm not interested, is the mortality figure low from a dairy point of view getting out? I'm not interested in, is it short gestation? All I'm interested in really is this animal going to give me a really good carcass weight for age? And is it going to shape well? Is it going to have is it going to score well on the grid when I bring it in? Is it going to return me a good level of profit? And that's really exciting from the point of view is that really what we see in the next number of years will be the technology is that you'll walk into the mart, you look up and you'll see a Beef's Own Worth index on that calf. And you might say, well, listen, don't necessarily believe all the figures in here, but if I see a calf that's in the ring that's a high Beef's Own Worth and a calf following in from it is a very low one, that is definitely going to influence the way I think how much I give for those animals. And really, we've really moved on with the whole the gene technology and testing for animals on that. And what we'd love to see in the next number of years is that every animal is genotyped so that you really bring reliability. Like, again, all these indexes are worth something, but it's what level of reliability that's in
Do you
them.
think are we getting close to that, or is it a big game changer? It's a massive game changer for beef farmers to get a calf genotype to Pearse.
Absolutely, and I think it's worth it in everyone's interest. There's a cost there, and okay, that's probably who covers that cost. But I think as an industry, if we stand back and look at this, that cost it's small in the bigger picture. You're looking at 15 to 20 euro over the lifetime of the animal to give the beef farmer the confidence to say, yes, I'm 30, 40, 50% confident rather than 15 to 20% confident in the figure. And that I can say, hand on heart, I have a much better chance if I buy 50 of these. Okay, you'll have individual animals that will show a high figure, and even if their genotype will show a high figure, and you'll be disappointed in them. But no different than we see on the EBI and the replacement index. If we get a team of animals, if on average, like a team of footballers, on average, they're all very good. Okay, some will disappoint and some will probably do a lot better than you would expect, but as a team, my 50 calves bought on a high beef's own worth. I think it'll be a real game changer when we get those figures, but the real game changer, as you say, Adam, will be when all those animals are genotyped as well.
Where does Jersey breeding come into this as regards Jersey cows and maybe even move it on to Jersey bulls? I think you've completed some analysis last spring showing that beef farmers would actually need to be paid to take these calves on to beef.
Yeah, listen, there's no way around this. The economics of dairy calf to beef production are very straightforward and very simple. There's three big things that go into whether you make a profit from a beef farmer on that. It's the price you pay for the calf, it's the cost of your inputs, and it's the price you get for the carcass at the end. Okay, so those three things have to work for you. And if the price of beef is where it is, unless the price of beef significantly increases or the price of our inputs significantly drop, the value of the Jersey, where there's a lot of Jersey genetics in the calf, unfortunately, it's very hard to see how those calves at birth, and this is the point I'd make at them, at birth they're not worth a huge amount of money. But then, I would always argue that an animal eventually becomes worth something, whether it's at 2 weeks of age, 6 weeks of age, 12 weeks of age, 6 months of age. It eventually becomes worth something for someone to take it on from there.
In relation to that, I guess I touched on this with Paul about more animals, more output, higher stocking rate, and your slides point to that as well. I guess the higher stocking rate, the higher output is more profitable. Is there a risk that we send farmers down that road again and we've a kill heading for 40,000 and beef prices down at, God forbid, 320, 330 and nobody makes anything no matter what your stocking rate is? Is there a risk of that happening?
Yeah, and that's always the problem with a high stocking rate. A high stocking rate is really good from the point of view when the price of beef is rising, you're going to take the benefits of that. And as you rightly point out, if we drop down to 320, 330 per kilo. Unfortunately, even at a low stocking rate though, that's not going to save you. So, for those farms who are commercially driven, full-time farming, bigger farms, there's no point in, again, getting around that. You're not talking 20, 30 hectare farms here. For the most part, you're talking significantly bigger farms than that. They're going to be looking for a higher price for beef. But the reality is, if we stand back and look at this, the dairy herd's not going to contract. It doesn't look like it in the next number of years. So these calves are going to be on the ground. They're going to be in the system. Someone's going to have to, we will have a level of live exports, and the higher that can be from a national point of view, the better, because it moves those animals out of the system, and they're not then 2 years later affecting the kill.
But at the current beef price and input costs and calf price, we're saying the vast majority of these farmers will lose money. Are we still saying because those calves are there, beef farmers need to take them on?
No, we're not. And we're saying you need to stand back and look at the economics. And that's the message we've been putting out the last number of years, is do your own sums, because we can bring out figures and Paul can bring them out from the research side and that. But the reality is you need to stand back and do your own figures and see how much money are you making. And that's where the profit monitor comes in. Like the profit monitor we have found with discussion groups and with clients over the years has really opened up people's eyes. Like I talk about gross margins and gross output and net margins per hectare. If we talked about that 10 years ago to the vast majority of beef farmers, it would mean very little talking about gross margin and gross output. Whereas now it's at the fingertips of most commercial farmers. They understand what gross margin, they understand the importance of gross output, they understand the importance of kilos of beef per hectare. But you need to stand back and look at your own figures, because it's all very well me saying what you can afford to pay for a calf. What I can afford to pay for a calf might be very different from Paul or for Kevin or what you can pay for a calf. And that's really what everyone needs to do. And it's only when people do their own figures and stand back, then you can decide, should I take on these calves or not? Because the reality is, as a dairy calf to beef farmer, I do have an option of saying, no, this year I won't buy calves. Do you know what I'll do? I'll wait and I'll buy runners in the back end, or I'll buy yearlings the following year. Suckler farmer is slightly different in that it's a much longer term investment. They have 20, 30, 40 suckler cows. You don't liquidate them overnight and then decide in 2 years' time, you know what, I'll get back into suckling. Dairy calf to beef, you do have that option.
Finally, give me a couple of points there, would say, coming out of the research project here in Grange, Johnson Castle, your dairy calf to beef project out on the ground. Give me 3 or 4 really important points in terms of maximising profit on a dairy calf to beef farm. What should I be looking at? Yeah,
so we've seen a number of areas over the years, Adam, that that if you get it wrong, it can go very wrong, and if you get it right, it can go quite right for you. And the 3 areas really that we'd be saying is, calf rearing. The calf rearing skills that are in the country. When I was young, we had dairy cows at home. We reared a lot of calves. A lot of our neighbours, I'm old enough to remember neighbours buying calves and selling calves, and the calf rearing skills were in the country. Okay, we've had to rebuild those skills because a lot of people now are buying calves that never reared calves before, and these are vulnerable animals. They're prone to a lot of things going wrong. That first 12 weeks is hugely important, and again we found that here in Teagasc in our research that if you get that right, grassland management. Again, second most important one, that if you're not going into low covers of grass, especially in the first year, and not very high covers in the second year either, going into those nice kind of 1,1400 kilos of covers in the second year. And the third big area we found that we really need to, but again this is probably across all beef farms to improve, is forage quality, winter forage quality. We've seen time and time again, people producing average enough quality silage, and if you produce average quality silage, the only way to get performance in weanlings and cattle over the second winter is you have to feed meal, and that's a cost. So if you can kind of get into that 70s DMD, cutting silage in May rather than June, things like that, but those are the 3 areas: calf rearing, grassland management, and forage quality in the winter.
Thanks, Pearse. Some real food for thought there. Kevin, moving on to you, last but by no means least.
No
we've listened here to Paul, I suppose, talk about slim margins on the beef side of the house. We've listened, on the suckler beef side of the house. We've listened to Pearse talk about thin margins on dairy calf to beef. I know you're going to make it all right now, and you're going to come along with your checkbook and give us loads of support to underpin these systems. But I guess, is there a solution to those low incomes? And maybe what is your solution to these low incomes?
Unfortunately, I don't think there is, and I think if you look not only in Ireland but globally, we're involved in a network called the Agri Benchmark Network, and it collects farm level data on farms all over the world, Brazil to Bangladesh to Ireland to United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And beef farming is always and everywhere a low margin business, low margin per hectare business. Beef farming out of suckler cows at a global level is, generally speaking, very, very extensive, based on backgrounding cattle in ranches and then taking their progeny and finishing them in feedlots. Ireland, along with other countries in northwestern Europe, finds itself somewhere in the middle. It has a suckler beef industry, but it doesn't have a feedlot industry, and it's raising those cattle off of beef like the ones you're looking at behind us here on the stage. So we're somewhere in the middle, but the fundamental economics and the fundamental physiology of producing beef are no different here really than anywhere else. It's a low margin business. Farmers making a living full time from farming beef in Ireland, or farming beef in Australia, or farming beef in Argentina or Brazil, are doing it on a scale that's above the national average. And all through the conversations that Pearse and Paul have been talking through, you're talking about farms at scales that are well in excess of the national averages. Okay, so even the national average farm doing a really good job with all the good technology and management practices that we need farmers to do, it's still not going to deliver an income that's comparable to incomes earned somewhere else in the agricultural industry, the dairy industry, and often it's not going to be comparable to the income that farmer could make if he or she worked full-time off the farm. So that. There's nothing unusual in this. I don't think there's been a big break point where everything has changed fundamentally if we look back in history. It's a low margin business, and people's income expectations have not stayed static. They now expect to have higher incomes, and how they're getting those higher incomes for many, many beef farmers is not working as much time on the farm. Let's be frank about it, it's actually having an off-farm job, or your spouse having an off-farm job. And that's a rational response to the incomes you're making per hectare or per livestock unit, but The key thing is the message that Teagasc is consistently saying, and we've heard it from Pearse and Paul, is that it's about doing as well as you can with that agricultural activity that you're choosing to engage in. So whether it's on a per livestock unit basis or a per hectare basis, you want to be doing as well as you can, closing that calving interval down, making sure the animal health is looked after so that you get that, you pay your money out, you have your costs, and you make sure that you get as much from that activity as you can, even if you're not spending your whole working week at it. And if you are spending your whole working week at it, it's the same fundamental message. You have to be basically as good as you can be with what you've got and your farm resources. And those individual farm resources and setups will really determine which of the paths that were outlined today by Pearse in terms of a dairy calf to beef system or a more traditional beef system that you choose to go down.
Anywhere in the world, and you mentioned Brazil and Argentina, they have either access to cheap land, cheap labour, hormones or supports. We don't have access to the first three there. We do have access to supports. Is supports the only answer? Are we really kidding ourselves here and trying to compete on a world stage with the likes of those countries that have access to cheap labour, cheap land and hormones? Can we do it, or is it doable?
Well, let's take your beef farmer in Argentina as an example. They don't have supports. In fact, for many of the recent years, they've had export taxes, right? Because the policy of the government was to basically keep cheap beef cheap for consumers as much as possible. So we're not in that space. We don't have a government or a society that wants to penalise beef farmers for producing beef. Okay, so thankfully we're not there. But I think that for all kinds of different reasons, we will continue to see society supporting beef farmers' incomes. I think what we will see is a change in the motivation for that willingness to pay basically subsidies to farmers. What do consumers and citizens want from farmers in return for the money that they're willing to give? And I think they are willing to give it. What they want is assurance that the food that they eat is safe. That's the first thing. But they also increasingly are concerned about how the food is produced. So it's about looking after the environmental impact of the production system, looking after things like animal welfare, looking after things like antimicrobial resistance. These are all things that consumers and citizens are worried about. And when you think about politicians being disconnected from society, I think that's really bogus, because if you look at the farm to fork strategy from the Commission, all those things are reflected in it. The signals are that consumers and taxpayers in the European Union like the European model of agriculture, but they want farmers, in addition to growing food that they want to eat, they also want farmers to look after the environment and to look after animal health and ultimately human health. So I think there's a movement up the agenda of those type of non-new priorities, but we still want food and we want safe food. So I think the farm income objective of policy hasn't disappeared, it's still there, and it will be delivered upon with the underpinning of good environmental and animal health and animal welfare practices.
Given the Irish history with traceability, environmental standards and our food production standards, does that put us in a very good position, or does it put us that the level almost has to go up again to another level as regards, we'll say, ticking a box for the consumer? I
think it puts us in a good starting position. Okay, but we can't rest on our laurels. What was the benchmark or the above average performance in the past quickly becomes the average. This is just competition at play. Okay, so I think Ireland starts from a really good position in a comparative piece with our competitors in the European Union, with the competitors in the UK and outside the European Union. But what we have to make sure is that what we do and how we develop going forward is actually adding to those characteristics. We want to be going into the marketplace this year and next year saying our beef really is super in all kinds of different dimensions, and this is why you should be willing to pay the price that will hopefully return more to the farmer in Ireland. Because if the consumers aren't willing to pay that premium price for some parts of our beef output, then we're not going to get very much north of 360, 370 euros a kilo. We need to basically have the commodity beef, making hamburgers, we're very good at it, but we also need to be selling that chunk of the carcass to European consumers that are willing to pay a lot more than for our beef than for just any old product that they can get on their supermarket shelf or in their restaurants. We need to basically position Irish beef and a segment of it, a very important segment of it, as a really high quality product.
So we've seen in the last couple of weeks that application for a grass-fed standard, strategically, is that important in terms of positioning ourselves or having a standard for that system of production?
I think it is. I mean, because that is our comparative advantage. Okay, that's what distinguishes us really from the European Union continental beef production systems, is that grass component. And it's the same for our Irish butter and as our Irish beef. It's about, establishing what's different about ourselves, making sure we maintain that, and then together with Board BIA and the industry, extracting it, or trying to capture a premium. Consumers don't have to give it to us. We have to persuade them that it's worth paying a little bit extra for something that is in some sense different. And it's about doing the good science to show that it is different, and then making sure in terms of the communication to farmers about best practice, that as we continue to be in that space where we can, as an industry, from farmer through to the Board BIAs and the meat companies, can actually be really confident about the fact that the product we're asking people to pay more for is worth that extra euro.
We've almost been speaking for an hour and we haven't mentioned Brexit. I'm going to mention it now. In terms of, I suppose, it still has the potential to be a massive shock to the the Irish beef industry. Are we any closer to knowing what will happen in the next few months, or what, in your opinion, could happen?
Unfortunately, we're no closer. I mean, I think it'll come down to the wire in terms of how the political process works between the European Union and the UK. People are increasingly confident that there will be a deal of some sort, but the proof is always in the pudding. It's what kind of deal do we end up with? I think the pessimistic message, unfortunately, is that the access we've been used to for the last 100 years to that UK market is going to disimprove. It's either going to disimprove because we'll face tariffs getting into the UK market, or it's going to disimprove because when we go into that market, we'll be facing competitors that we used to see in there, certainly not for the last 40 or 50 years, like your Brazils, like your Argentinas, like your Australias, New Zealands. And it's going to be a shock either way you look at it. Even if we get an agreement, the world will have changed, okay? And that it underlines the need for us to develop new markets and to develop additional value in the markets we're already supplying. And that comes back to the nature of our production system and what we're doing on our farms that persuades consumers in those markets, both the UK and the European Union, that it's worth paying a little bit more for Irish beef than beef from Brazil or Argentina or even from the UK or Germany.
Moving on to CAP timelines, where are we at on that? It's a big point of discussion there out on farms. How much longer will the basic payment scheme stay? Will it be the same level? Will all the other schemes be the same in the coming years? Have we any, we'll say, foresight on that and where it's going?
It's delayed, so it's not going to plan. Let's put it like that. I think we're behind time. The German presidency of the European Union is just about to start, and I think they're going to be pushing for a 2-year extension. So that means that the architecture of the policy won't change for quite a while yet, but the resources that fund that policy will change, and they're likely to be going down, unfortunately, from the perspective of Irish farmers.
And what could that mean for Irish farmers out there on the ground?
It means for the average farmer that the amount of money they get from the European Union pot is going to decline for the average farmer. But depending on how we as a country choose to design the cap in Ireland, whether or not you as an individual see less support from the cap or see more support will depend on what are the priorities for Ireland, because the new cap is a little bit different to the old one in the sense that it says member states have to address the 9 objectives of this new cap with the common funding, but those objectives and how they address them have to be tailored to their national priorities. So what is the national priorities and what are they in Ireland? Are they to keep it like it has been since 2003? I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. I think the world has changed a lot in 20 years, and we need to start to think about what do we want to get out of the cap? What are the challenges Irish agriculture faces? How do we want to use that 1.4 billion, 1.6 billion euros to do? I mean, what's the objective here? So I think we need to have those hard conversations in Ireland about what we want from the cap money. Increasingly it's going to be our money. We're now net contributors to the European budget. It's really important to use that money that we're more and more paying for ourselves to figure out what are the objectives of spending. It can't just be about maintaining the payment that your father got in 2003. based on what they did in 2001. It's crazy, okay? It's 20 years ago. We need to think about what are the challenges today and what are the challenges for the next 7, 10 years that we want to use that money to address now so that we're in a better place 7 years' time than we are today.
Suckler cow support payments, what's your opinion? Do we keep paying people to keep them on land, or do we let market forces dictate whether we need them or not? Where do you see that going?
This is my personal opinion. I don't think we should put up on a pedestal or an altar the 1 million suckler cows as something that can't ever be allowed change. Okay, if we go back before the McSharry period, there were a lot fewer suckler cows in Ireland. I don't think having a suckler cow premium is a good route to go down. I think we were there, we came out of it. I'm not sure it did much damage in one sense and would do much good in the other sense. The number of suckler cows, as Paul said earlier, is marginally lower than it was when decoupling happened. And some people thought it would halve the herd. In my wisdom, thought it would go down by about 17%. In reality, it's gone down by a lot less. I think we're better off thinking about what do consumers and taxpayers in the European Union and in Ireland want farmers to do. So, and support farmers for the maintenance of low intensity grasslands through the payment of paying them for doing that. And one of the key avenues in terms of maintaining those type of grasslands is that they're grazed and they're farmed by low intensity suckler cow beef systems, for example. Okay.
So schemes like BEEP and BDGP that encourage technical efficiency along with some environmental benefits, you'd have to say they're positive. They
are positive because they're delivering for the industry in terms of the carcass output that consumers want to eat, but they're also delivering for the environment in terms of the maintenance of the landscapes and the habitats that people value and are willing to pay not only in the supermarket for or in a restaurant, but also to their taxes. So it's important that we get value added for society from the money that we're putting into farming. And so the key will be about getting those designed well so that we get a good return and we can look back on the 7 years and say, that was money well spent. We supported farm incomes and we incentivized farmers to do things that we want them to do.
Looking to, I suppose, longer term, European beef production in terms of policy, I think some of the latest analysis from JIRA show that beef consumption in Europe is down 7-8% so far in 2020. Is that a real concern for Irish beef farmers in relation to, we export 90% of what we produce, so how do we deal with that?
It's a massive issue. I mean, we're seeing prices recover in the factories for finished cattle at the moment, and everyone thinks COVID's over, and unfortunately it's not. Okay, so I think the key will be how consumers go back to something that's like what they used to do in terms of their consumption behaviour. We don't know fundamentally whether they will and when they will go back to behaving like normal. A lot of the work we've done and people like JIRA have done is based on, well, where did the disease hit first and how they recovered? So using the China model. We're not China, so we can't be mega confident about that we'll follow the Chinese path. I think that consumers will go back to eating beef outside the home. That's the key change what's happened during the COVID pandemic, is that out-of-home consumption experience has been suppressed. People want to go back to eating steaks in restaurants. They want to go back to having a hamburger and chips. They want to go back to eating the kind of products that the Irish beef industry produces. I think the real risk is that they'll go back, but they just won't go back as much as they used to. So if you think about what happened in the foot and mouth disease 20 years ago, Irish lamb consumption dropped dramatically because the price of lamb went through the roof because of the disease. And lamb consumption is never coming back, has never gone back to where it was. So it'll be important that the industry, Board BIA, in terms of the promotion side across the European Union, that encourages people to go back to eating what is a healthy product and is an essential part of everybody's diet. And the success of that will be important in determining that that food service restaurant demand that we now understand is a critical part of what drives the price that farmers get, that gets back as close as possible to where it was. And then it's the job of the Irish industry to basically market the great beef that we produce as something that is in the top layer of that food service category, so that we persuade people to pay best price for our product in all of our markets.
Thanks, Kevin. Some really important weeks and months, I think, coming ahead for the Irish beef industry and Irish agriculture in general. A quick fire round, lads. Really quickly, they're almost yes or no answers. I'll start with Paul. Suckler cow numbers in 2030. Where do you see them at?
Is that a yes or no answer?
Will we have them at all, Paul?
He's going to ask everyone that question.
Will we have
Paul.
them at all? Will we have them at all?
I think Kevin alluded to it there, that there was an expectation after the previous reforms of CAP that numbers would go down quite dramatically. They haven't. It's a very resilient industry. At the same time, the numbers that are there at the moment, that 1 million plus that we've had for the last 15, 20 years, it's really an artificial number in a sense, in that if you go back to the early history of the suckler industry in Ireland, even go back to the 70s, you're looking at probably 400 to 500 suckler cows. And that was the market-driven number, if you like. We then had policy right through the 80s in terms of suckler cow premium and support, at the same time as quota imposition on the dairy herd. And that drove the increase in suckler cow numbers to where it is. We're now moving more towards a more, let's say, from a suckler cow numbers, there will be a market element. I think there will be supports. If we look at what the consumer demands around antimicrobial usage, the work out of Grange here has shown that we have very low antimicrobial usage. Work by Bernard Early in the last couple of years published has shown that, relative to international benchmarks and the proposals. If we look around the whole area of, carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, we know that, low intensity grazed systems support carbon removal from the atmosphere into biomass and into soil. So that is a benefit for the industry as well. And if we look more broadly in terms of the biodiversity and animal welfare standards that are required, a suckler industry supports all the consumer demands for that. So I think there will be supports in a different form, and I think that will help to support cow numbers to some extent. I think, there's no getting away from the fact that they are incrementally declining. I think that will continue to be the case, but I don't think we will see the collapse in numbers that some people might expect.
Pearse, where do you see suckler cow numbers?
Yeah,
2030.
2030. I mean, if you look there the last couple of years, Adam, you're probably talking. If you look at statistics, 1 to 2% reduction. Like if we saw that reduction happening over the next number of years, 1 to 2% over 10 years, it takes time. And I remember talking about this with Kevin. these things don't ever fall off a cliff edge. But even a 2% drop per annum, will get us back to 750, 800,000. It'd be very important though, as Paul said, in terms of those supports, if there are the likes of BDGB and BEEP. The reality is, and if you stand back and look at this, is who has suckler cows? We've seen the big drops is in the big commercial herds. We've seen all those. We've heard them all around the country. The 80, 100 cow herds, the people that have moved into dairying. Okay, I think we've seen probably close to the end of that now. Then you go to like our average suckler cow herd is what, 16, 17, 18, somewhere in around that. Which means there's an awful lot of herds of 10 and 12 cows. Who, as Kevin said, are working off farm. They're people, they're like us, they're teachers, they're dentists, they're doctors. Why would they get rid of the 10 to 12 suckler cows? It's something what they enjoy doing. There's nothing else they can do. Yeah. So, a lot of them would need to leave suckling for suckler cow numbers to drop below that 750 to 800,000.
Kevin?
Yeah, I mean, our baseline projections for 2030 would be just over 700,000 cows, suckler cows. I mean, it'll be about policy. And it'll be about the opportunities off farm that these people have. So it's about the sons and daughters of the people who established those entitlements back in 2001. What are they going to do? And the health of the non-farm economy. Will your employer demand more hours out of you? That may drive some people to basically get out of suckling, even though it's a land use that fits well with an off-farm job. And it'll be about those decisions at the micro farm level that will determine what the aggregate number is, and then that can be pushed up and down by things like an environmental payment that is targeted at low intensity beef farmers. That could basically persuade somebody who might have been considering reducing their cow numbers or getting out of cows entirely and leasing the land out to stay at it. And we shouldn't, and it's those kind of decisions. You need to be careful in terms of how you design policy, because one person getting out sometimes creates the opportunity for a neighbour to basically to get a bit larger and to be able to do things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do with their farm as it sits at the moment. Look at the dairy industry. 20 years ago there was almost 100% more dairy farmers than there are today, and we say the dairy industry is a shining example of success. But there's half the number of dairy farmers that there used to be, right? But and we bemoan the beef industry because Incomes aren't improving, but you know what? There's as many beef farmers today as there were 20 years ago. So where is the success? So we need to be careful, okay? We need to design the policy and think about the unintended consequences of having of something that might freeze a farm structure today that won't make sense in 10 years' time. We need to basically be careful about not introducing more rigidities into the system. Beef farmers in Ireland are incredibly resilient. They're very flexible, okay, and that's how they survived. I think we need to facilitate them in terms of helping to continue to do what they did in the past by adjusting the production system to the realities of policy, both in terms of income support and environmental delivery and what the market wants. And it's that flexibility we need to maintain.
Thanks to Kevin, thanks to Pearse, and thanks to Paul. And with that, it brings our week-long series to an end. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. There's a couple of thank yous. I guess behind the scenes, there's a massive amount of work goes into a production like this. On the Teagasc side, we have Declan McArdle and Loretto Ferguson, and on our own side, we have John Tobin from Traction Media. I'd like to thank all the participants in our panel discussions and all the farmers that we visited over the last couple of days. There's no doubt that the Irish beef industry has huge challenges to meet in the coming months and years, but I have also no doubt that with the help of stakeholders like Teagasc, it will rise above those challenges. That's all, folks. Safe farming.